Everyone, I'm Molly Dubin. I'm the curator here at the Jewish Museum Milwaukee. And as we just said, I am so excited to welcome you along with all of my colleagues and our presenters to our first in-person, actually hybrid program since the beginning of the pandemic. And we are just thrilled and honored to have our presenters here in person for this program because it's just that much more resonant on so many levels. So I wanted to give those people that are streaming, hello, people that are joining us online, you're just as much here with us as our in-person people, so welcome, welcome. But a little bit of housekeeping. So if you are joining us via Zoom and you have any technical challenges, there is a chat feature at the lower portion of your screen. We ask that you use that to identify any issues you may be having. And one of our programming team, likely expert Cassie up here, will try and help you with whatever technical difficulties you may be having. For those of you joining us in person, please know that we are using an owl. The owl is right there, and maybe you can surmise as to why it's called that, due to its visual similarity to an owl and its ability to turn its head all the way around. So it is a camera that allows sound. So if you could please do your best to stay quiet while in the audience, so that the camera stays on our presenters and doesn't pick up to you and swivel, that would be terrific. And one other note to those of us joining us via Zoom, if you could select the speaker view and pin it, that is going to be your best viewing option. So we ask that you do that. I would like to thank the Higuchi Family Foundation, who had presented a wonderful contribution that supported this show, but has enabled free admission throughout the entire run of the exhibit, which is a first for us and is meaningful on so many levels. Yes. The reason being, they want as many people to see this exhibit as possible, and as many people to gain some insight, understanding, and maybe for the first time, a reality check about this very dark chapter in history that resulted in the deportation and incarceration of 120,000 individuals of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of whom were American citizens, which occurred with the executive order of 9066 by President Roosevelt following the bombing of Pearl Harbor. But this is a very layered and difficult story, and we are honored to tell it, to educate about it, and particularly because so much of it was left out of education in public schools intentionally. So we are thrilled to bring it to you, and further to hear some of the personal stories at the heart of this narrative, which are really what makes it so heartfelt and helps us to connect with it. So with that, I am going to introduce our moderator for this evening. In the center here is Ray Locker. Ray is the editorial consultant for the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation. He has a master's degree in journalism from Ohio University and a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of Cincinnati. Before joining the foundation, he was an editor in the Washington Bureau of USA Today. The managing director of the Investigative Project on Terrorism, the Sacramento Bureau Chief of the Associated Press, and an editor and reporter at the Los Angeles Times, Tampa Tribune, and Montgomery Advisor in Alabama. He also worked with Foundation Chair Shirley Ann Higuchi on her history of the Heart Mountain Camp. So please welcome Ray. And next, I'd like to introduce Shirley Ann Higuchi, JD, Chair of the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation. She is the daughter of former incarcerees Dr. William I. Higuchi and the late Setsuko Saito Yuille. who were children when they were incarcerated at Heart Mountain during World War II. Shirley only learned of her mother's dedication to Heart Mountain when her mother was on her deathbed. Since becoming the Heart Mountain Chair in 2009, she has led the opening of the Foundation's World-Class Interpretive Center in August 2011 and wrote her memoir, An History of the Incarceration, in 2020. She's a senior director of the Office of Legal and State Advocacy in American Psychological Association's Practice Directorate, that's right. A past president of the DC Bar and a member of the Federal Law Enforcement Nominating Commission that selects federal judges for the District of Columbia. And we also have with us Kathy, can I call you Kathy? Absolutely. Kathleen Saito Yuille. Kathy was one of the 556 children born at Heart Mountain, where her parents and two older brothers and older sister were incarcerated. After the war, the Saito family returned to San Francisco, where Kathy graduated from high school before attending the University of California, Berkeley. She now lives in Milwaukee, where she became an active member of the Milwaukee Art Museum and served as board president of the Contemporary Art Society. She currently serves as the Milwaukee Art Museum Board of Trustees, the Milwaukee Art Museum's Board of Trustees. So again, we're thrilled to have all of our distinguished guests, and to moderate our program and discussion this evening, I'm going to turn the mic over to Ray.
All right, thanks, Molly. It's great to be back here in Milwaukee. My parents lived here for the first half of the 90s, so I know the city fairly well. It's just great to be here. We're going to start first with this video about Shirley and her book, and then we'll go through a series of slides and we'll have some questions and answers between Shirley and Kathy and take questions from the audience. So Cassie, if we're ready to go, let's roll the video.
Should you play on here?
Yes.
Okay.
I always knew that my parents met as children at a place called Heart Mountain in Wyoming. And my mother, Setsuko, always called it a place of love. It was only after she died, however, that I learned the truth. Heart Mountain was a prison. 14,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated there during World War II for the crime of looking like the enemy. Setsuko's secret is my attempt to understand the lives of my family, myself, and the complicated history of the Japanese American experience. Both sets of my grandparents immigrated from Japan. The Higuchis came first, arriving in 1915 from Saga on the southern island of Kyushu. They started farming in Santa Clara County, California. My mother's parents, the Saitos, came in 1918 and in 1923. They lived in San Francisco's Japantown and opened a store. Life in California was hard for Japanese Americans. State law banned immigrants from owning land, and Caucasian neighbors often resented their success. The children of immigrants called the Nisei had to work extra hard to prove they were loyal Americans. Despite hardships, many Japanese Americans found the good life and made their way in society. Some became professionals and owned their own home, and others excelled in college. But then came December 7th, 1941. After Pearl Harbor, wartime hysteria and racism intensified towards Japanese immigrants and Japanese American citizens. They called them spies or saboteurs, despite the lack of evidence. Then on February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which allowed the military to ban Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Census records told the government where to find Japanese Americans. Signs posted in neighborhoods said they had just days to pack and leave. They could only bring what they could carry. My family was issued a duffel bag with their name and number stenciled on the outside. Shikata ganai, some said, the Japanese term for it can't be helped. There was little resistance. They were first sent to assembly centers, which were temporary concentration camps on converted fairgrounds and racetracks. Some families slept in horse stalls and were forced to live like animals. This lasted a few months. Then the prisoners rode on a darkened train to one of the 10 concentration camps scattered across the US. My father remembers peering under the window shades to see where the train was going. My family was sent to Heart Mountain Relocation Center in Wyoming. Many prisoners wept when they saw their new homes surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Wind and dust swept through the tar paper walls. The barracks had no running water, the bathrooms had no privacy, and the mess hall food was terrible. Summers were sweltering and winters were brutal. The prisoners repeated another term, gaman, which means endure. In spite of this treatment, many incarcerees yearned to serve the country that imprisoned them. They enlisted in the army and fought bravely in Europe and the Pacific. But others stood up for their rights. More than 80 men at Heart Mountain resisted the military draft as long as they were prisoners. They were convicted and sent to federal prison. The rest of the Japanese American community shunned them for decades. My parents and grandparents spent 3 years behind barbed wire. After the war, they, along with many others in the community, wanted to put the shame and the rejection behind them. They never talked about it. My generation, called the Sansei, could not understand why. Only after my mother died did I realize the depth of her commitment to preserving the memory of the incarceration. She inspired me to understand this part of my family's history and my community's experience. Over the last decade, I've been committed to safeguarding against the racism and fear that drove the Japanese American incarceration. It was my mother, Setsuko, and her secret that taught me, and hopefully you, that we can never relax in the fight for justice. I always knew that my parents met as children at a place called
Yeah. Pull up the PowerPoint, please. Pull it out. Pull up. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
All right. I wanted to note that the video was woven together and edited by Vanessa Yuille, Kathy's daughter, Shirley's cousin, who's a filmmaker in Los Angeles, very talented, did a great job with that. She's worked on a number of things, including another documentary about Heart Mountain and her family's experience. That's very good to see. We believe Vanessa is a product of what school here?
University School.
Yeah, graduate of the University School of Milwaukee. So now we have the PowerPoint. I'm gonna click and Shirley is gonna talk a little bit about some of the slides.
These are photos that
we've had we have some in my book, but this is sort of the original photograph of the Higuchi family. This is circa 1930. And the photo on the bottom is actually my dad before the Heart Mountain Incarceration. He's holding an artificial gun, it's a toy. But what's interesting about this photo is the children behind him are Mexican, and there were Mexican immigrant families that my grandfather allowed to live on the farm. So what was interesting is before the war, my father was fluent in Spanish. And he lost that during his incarceration as a child. And when he left the camp, he was able to speak Japanese. So that's a little blast from the past. And that was their original farm that got lost during the war. It was 14.25 acres. With the Saito family, Kathy's family, this was taken before the war. Kathy wasn't born yet. She was born in Heart Mountain. And they lived in Japantown. And this is a beautiful photo of the family. And you can really tell that they're city folk compared to my father's farm community in San Jose. So I love this photograph. There's my mother in the middle. So this was in the film. So they were sent first. All of the incarcerees were sent to makeshift assembly centers. And this is the Santa Anita Assembly Center, which in the film, it was a racetrack. So they pretty much got them off the West Coast, put them in these makeshift camps that were racetracks, and while Heart Mountain was being built. So these photographs were actually taken by my father as a kid. He was able to get a camera that was given to him later on by his older brother. So he took the photo of the barrack, he took a photo of my grandfather below inside his barrack next to the potbelly stove, and a photograph of my grandfather and my Aunt Emily, who was 5 at the time. So she's now 85 years old. And this is a kind of an iconic photo. It's hanging in the museum now, but that's my mother Sets and my father Bill right in the middle. He's wearing his work boots from the farm, and my mother is dressed like she's from the city. And what I find really ironic about this photograph is that they were literally behind barbed wire. But looking at it, you really wouldn't know. I mean, you would just think it maybe it was a Japanese language school or something. But I always liked this photo, and I've treasured it and appreciate it, that it's hanging in our museum now. So the one thing that I talk about in my book is that I think that both of my parents really strived to assimilate. We first went to Wisconsin when I was little. This was taken, I think, when we had already moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan. But you could just tell by the way that we're dressed, and especially my little brother, Bob, who's wearing a little sailor suit on my mother's lap. I mean, it's a very classic American family. And you know, but for the Asian faces, you would leave it to Beaver kind of environment. So I always thought this was an interesting photograph. So in terms of assimilation, one of the byproducts of that is my father worked very, very hard. I mean, I think he was what would be termed as a workaholic. People don't use that term anymore as much for some reason, but he was always at the University of Michigan lab working, you know, 7 days a week. And meanwhile, I continued to assimilate into Ann Arbor, Michigan, and was a cheerleader. And if you look at all the kids in this photograph of the girls, you could tell I was the only Asian. I mean, it was challenging because I really had no Asian friends, no Japanese American friends at all. So in many ways, I was doubly insulated growing up in Ann Arbor. So I know you're going to have Donna Nagata, who's a psychologist professor from the University of Michigan, come, but she's done a lot of research in terms of children of the camps and essentially the intergenerational trauma that occurred from that experience. And some of the things that Dr. Satsuki Ina, who was incarcerated in another camp called Tule Lake, she noted that a lot of the incarcerees did have anxiety, depression, vigilance, and need for control, in uncertain situations. And I actually talk about that in my book. So this was a post-war war photograph. That's Kathy, the cute girl on the bottom right. And my mother's sets and my grandfather and my uncle. But my mother was on her way to Japan to apparently meet a suitor. And you know, when you hear about the story about my mother going to Japan after the war to meet a suitor, you kind of wonder, like, why is she going to Japan? I mean, didn't they lose the war? And wasn't that place really devastating, Kathy? I don't know, maybe you could talk more about that. But I just found this photo, it looked very joyous, but then I wondered what it must have been like for my mother to have to get on a ship to travel to Japan to meet somebody that she ended up rejecting. And she came back to the United States and ended up finding my father, because they recognized each other from camp in Berkeley. And, you know, their faces look identical. I mean, if you look at my mother's face, it looks pretty similar to the camp photo, so. And actually, I think I would recognize Kathy too, because that looks like you too. So, people don't change that much. And here's a photo of Kathy and my mother. And Kathy, were you in high school when this photo was taken?
Probably not. This is her graduate years. This is when Sets graduated from University of California. And I must have been about, in junior high school at that time. I recall because I was her junior bridesmaid, and I was in junior high school at the time. But Sets was always, you know, well-dressed, and she had belonged to a sorority there. And her Americanized name was Shirley, which she liked. Because Shirley Temple was very popular, even in camp. And so that it was Setsuko Shirley Saito was what she went by.
All right, I'm going to talk about this section. This is kind of the interesting convergence of the Japanese American incarceration and the Holocaust. Clarence Matsumura, whose family is shown here, and Clarence is down at the bottom, second from the right. He was actually born in Wyoming. His father was a Japanese immigrant who worked on the railroads. And you find in many of these Western communities, small pockets of Japanese Americans or Chinese Americans who came to work on the railroads and settled around where stations were. So the Matsumura family lived in various spots along the Union Pacific Railroad until they moved to Los Angeles. Opened a grocery store called the Wyoming Market, and they were there long enough to get swept up in the hysteria after Pearl Harbor, and they all went to Heart Mountain. Clarence left Heart Mountain during the war. He first worked on the railroads as a temporary worker. Then he enrolled in the University of Cincinnati, my alma mater. I had no idea when I was a student there of its extensive history with the Japanese American community and a number of incarcerees who relocated from camps there, courtesy of the Quakers, who set up an organization that took college students who were kicked out of their schools on the West Coast and found them schools elsewhere in the country. Clarence was drafted. He then joined, he was part of what was called the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion. It was the artillery component for the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which is known as person per person, the most highly decorated unit in all of World War II. One of the things that happened with Clarence, he was sent on an early kind of scouting artillery sighting mission and came across a number of prisoners who were being forced out of their slave labor camp, what's called the Kaufering Ring of slave labor camps around the Dachau camp in Bavaria. And they stayed in these barracks like this. They worked on underground and like aircraft and a variety of projects. At the end of the war, the guards forced all the workers out of the camp and put them on what was basically a death march somewhere to the Alps. And that is where this thing right here, I don't know how this photo was taken, but these are the prisoners being marched off to the Alps.
Okay, right, I just have to interject to say, we are familiar with this picture.
Okay,
And in fact, the individual, if you put this side, there's a soldier who has a gun like this.
Yeah.
The individual whose face you just see the profile of is former community member Jack Marcus.
oh, wow.
Wow.
So worlds collide even more. This was recounted in his book Light One Candle by Sally Ganor. Sally was rescued by Clarence Matsumura from this death march. They encountered each other almost 50 years later. They were brought together by a museum curator named Eric Saul, who met Clarence in the early 80s, learned of his story. Eric took a number of Japanese American veterans to Israel in the early 90s. He sought out Sally Ganor because he knew that he had been in this death march. At a meeting at, I think it was the Ramada Inn in Jerusalem, they met each other again for the first time since 1945. Sally recounted all of that in this book, Light One Candle. Heart Mountain has acquired the rights to this book, and we just republished it a few months ago. It's for sale in the back of the room. And there are Clarence and Sally at their reunion.
Yeah, and I just want to mention, Ray and I wrote the afterword to the revised published edition that's in the back of the room. And what was really nice is we wrote a really nice scroll where all the board members signed it, and my daughter was able to deliver it in Israel when Sally was alive. He just passed away a couple of years ago. So I was glad my daughter was able to meet him and represent me in that process. So right now we're in the process of building the Minetta Simpson Institute at Heart Mountain, named after Secretary Norm Minetta and Senator Alan K. Simpson. And the story of Norm and Al is that they actually met as children in the camp. Norm was a prisoner with my parents as children, and Al's father, who was a lawyer in the community, allowed both Al and Pete to go into the prison camp and play with the Japanese American kids, and that's where he met Norm. And they stayed in touch after all these years, and today they're still our advisors. I see them frequently. And this photograph was taken at the grand opening, and Tom Brokaw showed up for that, and he actually wrote the foreword to my book for those of you that have seen it. So the Minetta Simpson Institute is going to be a place for understanding, gathering, research, and training of officials and diplomats on the best practices during wartime crises, what not to do. And also will be a place where teachers from around the country could come and learn more about Heart Mountain and take it back to their school systems. So that's our new venture that ties into the future. And I think that's the end of the slideshow.
Yes, it is. All right. Okay, well, I'm gonna touch on some of the things that we saw in the slides. And one of the things, Kathy, that was interesting to me, and you mentioned it, your sister's other name, which is your niece's name. It goes to kind of the different interpretations that people have of this kind of history. Because obviously in the book, Shirley interprets her getting that name differently than you remember it. Can you elaborate on that?
When, as I mentioned, when she was at Berkeley, she was in a sorority, and at that time, she was frequently, they called her Shirley. And I recall when I was much younger and had ringlets like Shirley Temple. And it was Sense that got that ironing, curling iron hot. It was with a stove, and she would give me these ringlets. So I think, yes, my parents did want to become assimilated. Much later, I remember asking my father, didn't you ever want to go back to Japan? And he gave me the oddest look, like, are you nuts? I'm what? No, it was by choice. You know, he came here, like many young men, travel west. Well, I guess in this case, it might have been, but anyway. So I didn't know, they didn't talk about the incarceration as I was growing up. It was something that was probably very painful to them, but they never talked negatively, never had harsh words for those who imprisoned them. And I think it's cultural in that generation too, because I hear stories of others who would come back from war, or even those who were in the Holocaust, and it would be very difficult for them to talk about it. So I think it was that, it's partly shame too, to be, you know, back with neighbors, and but I guess the remarkable thing is that I didn't see the anger, because as Shirley mentioned, there are two words that are so ingrained in every child, and that is shikata ga nai, it can't be helped, you know, your ice cream drop too bad, you know, it's too bad, shikata ga nai. And the other one is gaman, to endure. And I think that helped in making that next generation, like my sister and brother-in-law, successful. It's true, the parents were my parents were first generation, and they expect high expectations of the children. And I think that owed to, you know, how they became assimilated and became successful.
Right. Shirley, one of the discoveries that you made when you were researching the book was that you realized your presence in Michigan and elsewhere in the Midwest was really part of a government plan. It was done by design to scatter the Japanese American population around the country. Want to tell me about how your feelings about that?
Well, obviously, when I was growing up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, I had no idea how I ended up there, except for the fact that's where my father actually got his position. But I think with the Higuchis and the Saitos, they sort of led, I think, in a lot of ways in terms of wanting to get out of California and assimilate and start new lives in the Midwest and the East Coast. So it seemed very typical in our family. But when you look back at the history that the government was able to usurp the rights of over 120,000 people, 2/3 were American citizens that were born in this country, and force them into camps in the inner Rockies and around the center of the United States, it really served to break up the family nucleus and really to destroy the family fabric. So I think that when, you know, folks left the West Coast and ended up settling in other places like Cincinnati and Michigan and elsewhere, I think it was really a way to sort of start over and build a life of success. And I think those that left the West Coast, and I think this happened to my parents, is they kind of left the incarceration experience behind them. And they were on the fast track to, I think, assimilating and moving up. And my dad has done very well, and my mother did well. But eventually, I think those things kind of catch up with you and your family. And I think part of it is that when, as a third generation Sansei, and I think this happened to Kathy's daughter as well, once you start learning more about what happened to your parents as children, you become angry, you become frustrated, you wonder why there wasn't anything in your history books. And I think that for me, I think it was sort of like a journey writing this book, and I think it was in many ways therapeutic. And I think I learned more about myself and my own family, in many ways since my mother died, which is kind of interesting, I think. Because she really never talked about the incarceration. She never really said anything bad about it. I remember one time she did get upset when I asked her, weren't you angry about that? And, you know, then she started screaming at me and telling me, you don't know what you're talking about. And I'm like, okay, you're angry too, you know, but she kept it carefully, I think, hidden. But on her deathbed, and actually Kathy was there, we were both in Salt Lake City when my mother was dying of pancreatic cancer. And she had told Kathy, and Kathy related to me, that she wanted her memorial money given to Heart Mountain. And we were totally stunned. I was like, why, you know? And I've learned since then that just because people don't talk about their experiences doesn't mean that they don't care about it. And I think deep down, my mother really cared about memorializing Heart Mountain and dreaming of something being built there. So if she were to look now at what we've accomplished there with the grand opening and now this institute, I think she would be totally stunned. And I think the great sadness is from time to time, I wonder like, well, what she would have thought about that.
You know, one of the things you mentioned about being forced to assimilate is it's made you very comfortable dealing with lots of different kinds of people. But one of the things that we talked about when you were working on the book was when you started to be more involved with Heart Mountain, you were less comfortable dealing with Japanese Americans. And can you tell us why?
Well, as you can tell by the cheerleading photograph, I mean, all my friends were black and white. And I was lucky because, you know, Ann Arbor was 45 minutes from Detroit. So we had a pretty good African-American population. And I think what I learned growing up in Ann Arbor was to get along with white people and black people, which really served me pretty well when I moved to Washington, DC, right? And was a lawyer, and there weren't a lot of Asian lawyers there. So I accelerated really quickly, I think, with the DC legal community and was very employable, and I related well to people. But then when I got involved in the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, I had to deal with all these Japanese Americans from the West Coast. And it was very challenging because if you don't grow up around Japanese Americans, you don't know how to relate in the way that you might otherwise be able to do if I grew up in LA. So it was a challenge. And I do think, you know, the trauma of this incarceration experience, and it's similar with the Holocaust experience. A lot of times there's a lot of infighting and divide within your own community because they sort of see that experience differently. And I think that right now the Japanese American community is slowly coming together to have a more unified voice on working together to preserve these sites instead of working, you know, against each other. But if you look at the film and the slides, you know, those that volunteered for the military were seen as war heroes, which they were. But the ones that resisted, which were basically cutting edge civil rights advocates at the time, were shunned by the community. And we're slowly now resolving those differences. And I think in my lifetime, I think we'll be in a very different place in the next several years.
I guess the one thing I just wanted to mention was the fact that we've had these pilgrimages and where the survivors who were incarcerated would return. And it's always been such an emotional experience for them. And as we were just talking earlier, even I was really unaware of what had happened. And it took someone like Shirley, not her mother, but Shirley, and it was like my daughter who kept on prodding me, asking me questions, a lot of which I couldn't answer because my parents never talked about it. So the eye-opening experience was at university school, a 5th grade history teacher. Her topic was in reporting on the incarceration. And he basically said it wasn't an internment or a concentration camp. And she was so furious that, and she holds it in, she was crying, she just left. And the librarian told me, my daughter then, well, I wasn't at school at that, with her at that time, but I heard about it, and the anger that she felt was where the tears were just barely there, and then she burst into tears. So I think the generation now, and Shirley probably feels the same, well, learning about what had happened and not learning it firsthand. And I guess I was going to say that we're unfortunately losing that generation who lived through it. And even the Jews, the Holocaust, you read those stories. And firsthand stories or hearing it firsthand is nothing like really, you can read about it. But when you meet these people and at these pilgrimages, that generation is becoming fewer and fewer. But there's something there that they would return, and it's that power of place, which is so strong. And people just choke up. So it's a learning experience, and this is not just the Japanese. I've had a friend who recently passed away, and she joined me at one of the pilgrimages. She burst out crying. And she's Caucasian, and then we were in a setting where we were all socializing, and then she turned to me crying, and she said, "I'm so sorry, so sorry." I thought maybe she was feeling ill. I mean, it was the furthest thing from my mind, what she was talking about. But she had it all bottled in, and she heard the stories and talked to people and saw our museum, saw the mountain, understood then what that generation went through. And so she got it. And she grew up in Michigan. She got it.
One of the things we've seen recently, certainly in the last year and a half, is a lot of attempts by state legislators to sanitize history, very often in conservative states. But one of the things we've noticed at Heart Mountain, Shirley, is that we've had a lot of support from the local community there in a very conservative part of a very conservative state. Tell us a little bit about how you bridged some of these cultural and political divides as you go about doing your work as the chair of the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation.
Well, I really think it's because I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, to be honest with you. I mean, I grew up at a time when Republican and Democrats were both considered good people. And you knew that whoever was elected, everything would be okay. And nowadays it's become sort of a more divided political structure. So I think my training growing up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and being able to relate to a wide variety of people, including conservative white people, served me well. And I have very good relationships with a lot of people in Wyoming. I'm hosting an event in DC from somebody who's coming in with the Buffalo Bill Historical Center of the West. And I have great relations with the Simpson family, and they're dedicated. I think it's being able to walk a line of respect and embracing everyone into your community and listening and working together towards a common goal. And it's been a real great pleasure chairing the foundation and working with both communities, Japanese Americans and with the Wyoming community.
Kathy, tell us a little bit about your work with the folks at Cody.
I had at one of the board meetings, there's one, the vice chair, Doug Nelson. And he was the former president and CEO of the Annie Casey Foundation that was founded by UPS. So, and he loved to delegate. So I was selected to be the chair of the a pilgrimage, in other words, to organize things, which, okay, a delegation of work and everything. And in that process, well, those of you who know me, you know, I could be very compulsive. I went several months before to just get the lay of the land, because I had never been there. And I met the people, I met the director of not only Cody, but the Powell Travel Bureau, and the various, and even the printer. They were all so openly friendly and literally just, you know, embraced us. There was one person that one of the board members, actually an internee, a former internee, had met on a plane, and she was a physician. And I got to know her, and she wanted to put up signs. Now remember, this is the first time that we're all getting together. The museum was being built, but she had signs made welcoming us to Cody, the place where there were signs too, you know, no Japs allowed. And so this was a community that was willing to change, and they knew about, well, not everybody, but those who knew about the museum welcomed having it there. And so every year we have, you know, a pilgrimage, and it seems like the entire community is openly, you know, friendly and welcoming.
And that reminds me of the Sam Mahara story, where he came to the grand opening. He was incarcerated as a child, and he remembers the signs that said, you know, no Japs allowed, you're not welcome here. And when he saw the signs that Dr. Schmidt put up, he felt welcomed. And so one day he showed up in my office in Washington, DC, and he said he wanted to get involved. And now he's on the board and he travels around the country, and he's one of our single largest donors. And we just named a theater after him in the museum. So it's kind of nice that a lot of this has come full circle. He didn't want to come to Wyoming, he hated it. And when he finally came, he realized the power of place and I could make a difference. And he's now heralded as a great lecturer on the topic.
In the same vein, a little different, but a board member wrote a book, Hello Maggie, and the cartoonist who drew it was Willie Ito, who actually did that one scene with Lady and the Tramp where the two dogs kiss each other with the spaghetti kind of flowing out and all that. And Willie was at another camp, Topaz camp, had not been to Heart Mountain, but then our board member decided that he would invite him. And this man, Willie Ito, the cartoonist, at the board meeting, started to choke up. He said, I've drawn that mountain so many times in the books, but now that I've seen it, he says, I'm just, you know, he just couldn't express himself because it brought back memories of those who had been there.
Yes.
Don't you find some of that ironic that in this horrible place, you've built a museum and in some ways sanctified it? Doesn't that, at any point, didn't you just think there's a little bit of nuts here about this? And part of why I ask is that I grew up in an institution, and it was foster care institution. And I know about place. When I think about that, I think about that place. But what happened to me in that place was awful. Now, isn't it, at any point, did you think, yeah, what am I doing?
Well, that's actually an excellent philosophical point. And we made a conscious decision not to have it be federally run museum like Manzanar, which is run by the National Park Service. And we decided that we wanted it independently owned and operated so we can have free speech. And the majority of the board, thanks to Doug Nelson, that Kathy had mentioned, has always ensured that the majority of the board is Japanese American descendants. So when we talk about actually truly learning about what had happened there, our decision was that the power of the place, the significance of building a museum, a research institute, and a powerful place where we could have open discussion had the greater good involved than not by doing that. And I always say to people that if we can build a world-class museum and an institute in Wyoming and work together across the aisle to see that accomplished, I think we could do anything. And that's why we want to be a place, for example, of how to do things right and how to support each other when at one time in 1942, the support wasn't there. It's really a story of growth, change, evolution, collaboration, and acceptance. And I'm proud that we're able to do that. I really am.
Well, it's also interesting that if Heart Mountain and the descendants don't tell the story, then other people tell it for them. And before this museum got started, before the local people started to come up with the idea of doing something there, the American Legion put a plaque there in the early 1960s that was very controversial and basically totally misrepresented what happened. Said, you know, people were put there for their own safety, ignored all that. And so that was stuck in the craws of many people who were behind the creation of the center there now.
I have a question for Kathy, about your daughter who was at university school.
Yes.
If the teacher didn't think it was an internment camp, what did they think it was?
I think perhaps he might have thought that it was for our safety and that it was for their good.
So that's other people telling the story.
Exactly. But that was a common thing. I think we had an event once and some gentleman asked, you know, but weren't the camps constructed for your protection? And then the response is there were guard towers and the guns were pointed in to the camps, not out. So you can make up any story you want in that sense. But I think your question is interesting because I can understand the pain that you must feel. But I think with building the museum though was for a lesson that shouldn't be forgotten. It's educational. It was for not only those to heal, but also for the generations that follow, because history shouldn't be forgotten and not repeated. But of course, history always takes a different twist and repeats itself.
Want to take control back of the narrative.
Yes,
Right.
exactly.
Which have been, which have been the truth withheld or twisted for propagandistic purposes. So the importance of taking that control and putting and instilling the voices of those who experienced it and who are still feeling the repercussions.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Yes, ma'am.
What happened to the land and the houses that the Japanese citizens owned?
Well, for the Higuchi family, they lost 14.25 acres, now known as Silicon Valley. And Ray and we had a question about what the value of that. So Ray did some rough numbers.
$65 million. If you look at what that land has been subdivided into 1/4 acre lots where houses sell for $1.5 million each. Which just shows you how crazy Silicon Valley real estate is. Yeah, it comes out to about $65 million. It's down the street from a large public hospital. It's worth a lot of money. But the extension of that is what happened to the camps after the war. Basically, if you had $1 and the ability to take a barrack away, you took it away. They divided up the land that Heart Mountain was on to homesteaders who came back from World War II, and they applied to get some of the land. And it was actually one homesteader family, the Blackburn family, who came from Kansas, homesteaded in northwestern Wyoming on former Heart Mountain land, who provided the impetus for doing something there. Because they realized after a while, why are all these Japanese people showing up around here asking me for directions? They were going back to camp. And so they got the original group of people organized to do something there.
So if the family's left with nothing, everything's been taken from them. How did you said the Quakers helped to get you to Michigan. Did they set you up in houses? I mean, how did people rise from that?
Well, my family wasn't directly connected to the Quakers. I really honestly, to this day, don't know how they did it. I really just don't know. And Kathy could talk about her own family's experiences. What I knew about the Higuchi side of the family was that they suffered a lot after the war. And I think your father, my grandfather Saito, did too, but I think he put on a better face than maybe the grandfather Higuchi. But my grandfather Higuchi was, when they were leaving or about to leave, he was trying to go find a place to live. And he had a heart attack. He had a heart attack going into the camp. He had a heart attack leaving the camp. And when you look at his war relocation files, it literally showed sympathy from the staff, worried about the Higuchis because they really had no place to go. I mean, period. They had to start completely over, working for a white family in Los Altos Hills, and my grandmother became a maid, and my grandfather was a farmer. Now, Kathy, you could probably speak more about the struggles of the Saitos.
When, after, it is remarkable how they were able to pick themselves up. I recall when I was young, maybe 3 or 4, I have no recollection of the camp, by the way, I'm internment. My father worked at a yacht club as a busboy. Worked long hours, of course, took the bus, and somehow managed to save enough money to start a business. He was in the business of art, the kimonos and things. He called them art goods, but that has a different connotation. It's Oriental art goods. I remember his stationery. But he built it up, and you just kind of wonder how, I always wonder how someone can learn about plumbing, just by not just instinct or something like that. Well, my father knew how to start his business. He had to find a store, but he learned English. He learned how to write. He went to a business school, night school, and learned all that. And he had a beautiful penmanship, and opened up a store in Oakland, and got the cabinetry up and all this. And frankly, I don't know how they did it, but they somehow, that's not an uncommon story, that they would come with nothing and, get money and set an example for their children. By the way, education was really very, very, very important for that generation. But yes, my family, suffered. But it didn't keep, as I said, they still were not bitter. They just moved. They didn't look back. They wanted to look forward and build something for their family and their children.
So just to add to that, this idea of resilience in the face of loss. Of course, we have some people joining us online here. So from our good friend Ron Kuramoto, president of the Japanese American Citizens League Wisconsin chapter. Just to give some more insight to that question, Ron shared that a forensic accounting firm in the early 1990s conservatively estimated that Japanese Americans incarcerated during World War II lost property, farms, houses, businesses, etc., worth a total of $110 billion to $130 billion in 1990 dollars, not including lost wages, savings, investments.
And of course, we now know that a lot of the incarceration and that happened on the West Coast was due to political, monetary, and other reasons. Because why wouldn't they incarcerate the Japanese Americans in Hawaii, where the Pearl Harbor bombing took place? So if you want to talk about ironies, that one is pretty ironic. I don't know if you want to amplify on that, right?
Well, if they had forced the Japanese from Hawaii, Hawaii would have ground to a halt. They were like 40% of the population. They basically made the islands work. On the mainland, it was openly stated in congressional testimony by farmers, white organizations like, you know, the Sons of the Golden West in California, that economic reasons and jealousy were a big part of why they were doing what they were doing. Yes, sir.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to remember reading a letter that would confirm what you just discussed. And there's more than one letter that's in the museum there where it stated, is that correct?
I'm not sure if I know what letter you're referring to. Do you, Ray?
About economic reasons, and yeah, oh yeah.
Okay, that's an exhibit in the museum. There was at least one letter, maybe another one, that set out the value of the land and getting the land. Maybe a question of timing as to whether it was dated prior to people being taken out or after, what to do with it. But yes, that letter from that.
And what's interesting is after the Japanese Americans were incarcerated, they lived in these places around the West and in Arkansas that had lots of farms around them. And all of a sudden, these white farmers realized they can't bring in their crops because so many of the men who used to bring in the crops were now overseas. So they had the Japanese Americans leave the camps and come and basically save the sugar beet crops throughout the Mountain West and other places. And in the Heart Mountain newspaper, basically every edition would be tons of help wanted at, come and move to Michigan to work in an apple farm, a place like that, that these people who were so skilled at making really unproductive land terribly productive were in great demand from people all over the country to save their crops.
So I'm gonna pose another question coming to us online, because I think it really is at the heart of so much of what we're talking about here, and very resonant in its connection. Wisconsin recently passed a law that requires schools to teach about the Holocaust. Has there been any effort by Heart Mountain to get the story of the internment taught in schools?
I'll let Ray lead that question.
I'm the project director for 2 week-long workshops we're having this summer, and we had them last summer, to teach educators from around the country about this history. Sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities. It's pretty hard to get these grants. We're very excited about it. Last year we did it virtually. This year we're going to be bringing 36 teachers each week to our facility so we can show them where it happened and use the power of place to do that. And as we've picked the people who are going to participate in this program, we had an eye towards some of the states like Illinois and New Jersey that have recently passed laws requiring Asian American education in public schools. Because we want to hit that sweet spot where there's an interest in this and the people who are going to spread it around the country. So one of our teachers who participated last year was from Florida, couple of weeks ago, Shirley and I participated in a similar event that she was having with teachers from Palm Beach and Broward counties in southeast Florida, where they were helping those teachers learn about this. So the idea is we're gonna pollinate this topic and this history in school districts around the country to make it, one, so people know that this happened, and make it harder for people who don't want this to be taught to get their way.
Okay, can you expand on that in terms of the divisiveness surrounding critical race theory?
Well, first of all, critical race theory is a legal theory taught primarily in law schools. I don't think it's ever been taught to anybody at lower than a law school level. It's certainly not what we teach. Some people want to make any mention of troubling racial histories. They want to lump it as critical race theory. It's not. I mean, the fact is that, as I mentioned earlier, so many of the things that happened had a racial component. It was openly stated. You saw it in the newspaper headlines and the slides and in the film. I mean, the JAP were thrown about liberally. People were targeted because of what they looked like and where they came from. And we're not making that up. That's fact. And so, and it's uncomfortable for a lot of people. I know that when I've been involved in some of these workshops as a white male, I feel a twinge of guilt and sadness for what people who look like me did to people who didn't look like me. We understand that, but you can't shy away from this as something, you know, that happened or didn't happen. It definitely happened.
It definitely did happen. And I'm sorry if I'm jumping on anyone who I don't want to take away from the audience here. So kind of, you just mentioned, you know, the understanding of that in terms of people that, you know, have some background in law. Shirley, legalities played such a critical role, suppression of evidence presented to the Supreme Court. How does your, you know, your education in the law, your understanding, your, you know, you're kind of having insight to that world, how does that kind of shape your perception of what was or not shared with you by your mother and your understanding of this experience?
Well, I mean, it even goes farther than my own family not talking to me about this. When I went to the University of Michigan undergrad, there was no course or information at that time when I was going that taught about the incarceration experience, and not a lot about Asian studies, period, Asian American studies. And the same thing when I went to law school. I don't want to give away my age, but you know, I'm sure nowadays you could probably find law schools that will talk about the constitutionalities and the Supreme Court cases and all that. But I didn't have any of it in high school. I didn't have it in undergrad, and I didn't have it in law school. I had to seek it out. So it is challenging when you're my age and you have to learn about everything that you should have learned as a child. So it's a bit overwhelming. I probably had more individualized growth in the last 10 years than I've had in my entire lifetime. So the good news is I think I've finally come full circle and I'm more of a whole person today than I was 40, 50 years ago. I mean, the bad news, it took me that long to do it, and I don't want to have other children or my children go through what I had to go through, which is being very insulated from the information that we need to share with everyone.
I know that you said that, you know, you felt kind of completely bereft of this, you know, this history. It wasn't until your mother was on her deathbed that, you know, you began to kind of be able to get inside that lacquer box that you refer to, you know, and the fact that so much wasn't talked about, but that, you know, what you have uncovered, your research, everything that you've learned, everything that you've gotten into in the involvement here with the establishment of the center has changed your relationship with your father. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, as I said earlier, you know, my father was a workaholic. I mean, you know, he's done extremely well coming from where he came from. I mean, chairing the pharmaceutics department at the University of Utah, starting up a couple of startup companies in Salt Lake and research. And it was very hard, I think, to talk to him growing up because we really didn't have anything in common. I mean, he was working all the time. He didn't share his incarceration stories. But after my mother died, he really opened up and began talking about his incarceration experience, was fascinated by it, supported me in the effort, supported Kathy participating, and he's one of our biggest supporters now at Heart Mountain. So I think, life is full circle, I really feel that, I'm not saying that the incarceration was meant to be, but to be honest with you, but for the Japanese American incarceration, I wouldn't be sitting here, because my parents would have never met. So then you start looking back at things and you say, well, this is part of my life story, and that's what my father told me once. He said, this is part of who I am. And that's why I don't feel a lot of negativity and anger, because it's part of who he is. And I guess that's true acceptance.
More questions from the audience here? Not, I maybe have one final question. We kind of started off in the elevator talking about your knowing Donna Nagata, and the issue of generational trauma. I mean, just in this talk this evening, and certainly we get into the exhibit, but looking at the different impacts and responses through the generations, and you can speak to in the book the Sansei effect, looking to the current and future generations. What do you think is their responsibility, and what is your hope for them?
You mean the what I have hope for the other sanseis or the children?
The one that those that are involved with activism now and maybe are becoming, just aware of histories and grappling with that.
I think what I tell all the young people I meet, even people my age, is that talk to your parents and grandparents while they're still alive. So you could keep, I said, you don't have to be a professional writer, just keep a journal and a diary, an interview, or use your phone. And try to get as much knowledge as possible and save that knowledge and learn from it. But I think we're in a better place now when it comes to assessing information than when I was growing up. So, I mean, with the museum and our virtual events and our capabilities, my hope is that we can educate everyone and everyone will learn from this experience.
Yeah, closing comments.
Well, I think it's a lifelong process for all of us to mature and learn about what happened in the past. Unfortunately, I feel like schools are holding up their part with history. So hopefully, I guess education still is very, very important to across all people, and we could only try our best in improving the future generation and understanding, and that's part of what the Manetta Simpson Institute hopes to achieve. Make it like a think tank,
I just wanted to say thank you for coming out, and thanks to the individuals who called in, and thanks to the museum for hosting us. This has been an incredible experience, and I hope you'll come out to Heart Mountain if you haven't, or at least get online and look at our website, www.heartmountain.org. Oh, and there's brochures in the back too that have maps of the camp and the museum. Thank you very much.
That from you. Thank you. Oh, turned off. No worries. So thank you to all of our presenters. You were absolutely incredible. Thank you to our audience. I want to thank again the Ibuki Family Foundation for enabling free admission to the exhibit throughout its run, which ends May 29th. We have a slate of incredible programs that we've had throughout the entire run. Of course, this evening, We've got several more coming up. You can get details online on our website, but we have a program with Lisa Doi, who's with Suru for Solidarity in Chicago on Thursday, May 12th. And she's going to be talking about Japanese American activism, civil rights, and broader immigration. On Thursday, May 19th, we will welcome Dr. Donna Nagata, who will talk about intergenerational trauma stemming from incarceration. And then also on May 25th, we have a program looking at the 442nd and segregated troops with Erin Aoyama, who actually has done a lot of very interesting research, tying her own family to some of her studies and connecting it to some of the troops that were in the South during World War II. So lots of interesting programs. Thank you so much. I know I don't know if we have books left, but some of you have purchased them. If there are any left, please feel free to buy books. Okay, we're out. Those of you who have them, I think there's openness to signing. And again, thank you so much. If you haven't had a chance to see the exhibit, come back. It really is not to be missed. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.